Bonjour and welcome to the Red Lake Nation College Gikendaasowin podcast, a RLNC space to discuss topics on culture and language, history, community happenings, and student spotlights. This week in the studio, we have Red Lake Nation College Vice President of Operations and Academic Affairs, Mandy Schram, and podcast intern, Nataya Neadeau, reviewing some of their favorite podcasts. Red Lake Nation College would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for their generous support in the creation of this podcast. We hope you enjoy this podcast. Miigwech. Mandy Schram, Vice President of Operations and Academic Affairs and podcast intern, Nataya Neadeau, discuss and review a variety of podcasts from various genres. This idea for a podcast came about as Mandy and I were discussing our favorites when we realized there are a lot of people who have never listened to a podcast before. So we decided to talk about a variety of free podcasts available through apps like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others. With that, Mandy Schram will start us off with the first review.
All right. Well, thanks, Nataya. So I want to start off with one that's a light and easy listening podcast. So one of my favorite ones is called Dark History. And so the podcast I'm kind of talking about today, well, briefly, is episode 58, and it's called Clowns That Kill, The Dark History of Clowns. The podcaster for this podcast, her name is Bailey Sarian. She also has another weekly podcast called Murder, Mystery, and Makeup. And that one she presents on a YouTube channel so that she can demonstrate various makeup tips and tricks. So if you're interested in makeup and murder, she's the person to listen to. Her podcasts, the Dark History podcasts, are all light and funny. She's just a regular, curious person. She's not an expert on any of the topics in her podcasts, but she explores the dark history of many topics, including cannibalism, witches, ghost ships, soda, mailing babies through the postal service, cigarettes, student loans, and many other topics. Bailey also has a pet crow named Joan Crowford. This is a general, easy listening podcast for pretty much any age, maybe not really young children. The pacing is really good. It's easy to understand her podcast, but I will warn you, some of her podcasts, the volume kind of is up or down. You have to adjust the volume on your end. But overall, I would give Dark History and Bailey Sarian a 5 out of 5 for her podcast. She's funny and she's just easy to listen to.
My genre is crime, and the title of the podcast is Morbid. They did a segment on Savannah Graywin. She was a Native American woman who was from the Spirit Lake Sioux tribe, and she was 8 months pregnant. There was a woman named Brooke Cruz who asked Savannah to try on a dress, and later she was to be murdered by Brooke Cruz and dumped into a river, and they took her baby out of her stomach because she was 8 months pregnant, if I didn't say that. I really liked how they explained everything. They went into depth of information that I didn't really know myself. And I think they made me understand a lot of the big law words in the case that were used and how they were sentenced. And I really like how they talked about the podcast. I'd give it 4.5 out of 5.
All right. So the second one that I'm going to talk to you about is a dark, dark one. This one is called Collapse, Disaster in Surfside. It's a 12-part investigative podcast produced by the Miami Herald. In case you don't know, in the middle of the night on June 24th, 2021, a 12-story section of the Champlain Tower South condominium complex fell to the ground, killing 98 people in Surfside, Florida. This 12-part investigative podcast, produced by the Miami Herald, explores what went wrong, who will be held accountable, how something like this could happen, and if it could happen again. Audio clips from the actual events and interviews with survivors are included. Stories of the lives lost are told by narrators and residents of the apartment complex. The podcast covers the history of the deeply dysfunctional development of the building amidst few regulations, the lack of response to the recertification recommendations of the building, and the condo association board that deferred maintenance year after year, leading to this collapse. For those of you who remember this happening, I just couldn't get enough of this information because I couldn't believe that something like this could happen in the United States when not in the middle of a war. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you see in other countries during times of war. And this building just pancaked to the ground. And some of the stories are just heart-wrenching. One of the women who lived there saw the pool deck collapsing, and she went out on her balcony and called her husband. And she said the pool deck collapsed. And a few seconds later, the phone went dead, and she was one of the people who died in the collapse of this condo. It was 13 stories tall, so you can imagine the pancaking of each level. As far as the audience goes, this is not a podcast for children. It's deeply emotional, very traumatic, very heart-wrenching stories. The pacing is great. I'd give it a 5 out of 5. I could clearly understand it. I thought the stories were just really compelling. Overall, I would give the entire series a 5 out of 5. But again, trigger warning that it's very, very sad.
Wow.
So there we go.
My next one is motivational. It's called How to Let Go of Being a Good Person. We all tend to believe that we're good people, and sometimes if we do something bad, we let it drain on our personality, and we think that, oh, well, I did something bad, I'm no longer a good human. This podcast showed me that we're all decision makers, and that sometimes what we do is not always going to reflect on our whole personality as one mistake. And it's letting go of being perceived as a good person, because everybody's going to have a different view on you as a person. So I think that this podcast really made me understand that it's okay to not be perfect and that I'm going to make mistakes. And it made me realize why I become so defensive with my identity of being a good person when I am questioned. The pacing of this podcast was really good. It was kind of short, which I really like about podcasts. I don't really like listening to long, lengthy ones, but they made this one pretty fun to listen to and made me understand some of the things about myself as a person and how to deal with trying to be a good person.
All right, my next one is called the Canvas Casters Podcast. I listened to episode 45, Discussin' Discussions, part 1. The audience for this kind of podcast is really only going to be faculty members, maybe instructional designers. No one else is going to want to care or listen to this podcast. This podcast focuses on talking to students about how to be a productive discusser on the Canvas discussion board. The hosts also discussed settings and how to limit options for what students can and cannot do, including adding attachments and deleting posts. They did talk about student introductions during the first week, and one of their recommendations, which I did think was a good idea, was to have students submit photos and a video introduction of themselves, especially for asynchronous online courses. I would give it a rating of 2 out of 5 for pacing. The first 10 minutes was just chatting about unrelated topics. I don't think they even mentioned discussions in the first 10 minutes. As far as understanding goes, I would give it a 4 out of 5, but that's only if you have a background in Canvas. Then it's easy to follow and understand if you've already been using discussion board features and things like that in Canvas. If I based my opinion on this podcast, just on this episode, it wouldn't be very good. I would probably give it a 2 out of 5. But I'm also open to the idea of checking out additional podcasts because Canvas is the learning management system that we use here at Red Lake Nation College. And I'm always looking for new ideas and tips and tricks to make things easier for faculty and students. So even though I didn't rate it very high, I might give it another try.
My next one is news by a podcast called Today Explained. They talk about student loan forgiveness. And as a college student, I was really scared of going into a university and thinking about how I'm going to pay to stay in school. And everybody in my finances classes were always like, oh, never take out loans. You're going to regret it later on in life. And I think that really scared me. And to see that Biden was promising the student loan forgiveness when he was elected president, and for him to finally come out and say that they were going to fulfill it. And then there was lawsuits filed against it. And I just can't imagine what the people who were so excited about this felt like with the rug getting ripped out from underneath them. I think that this shed a lot of light that I didn't know what was happening. And I personally see one side that I believe, and it's like, oh, this side is really going to help a lot of people. But there is that other side of people who believe that this is not going to help them and they don't want to have to pay extra taxes on it. Arizona said that if they were to cancel, they would lose out on tax revenue in the future years. And the Biden administration should have seen this coming if their plan was to cancel student federal loans. I really liked listening to this. It shed light on a problem that we were facing. It showed not only that the good of the student loan forgiveness, but that it also had a downside. It made me feel bad for all the people who were left in the dark about if their debt was going to be canceled or not. I really liked listening to this one. It made me understand some things that I really didn't know that were there, and it was paced really well. The person who explained it, they made it pretty easy understanding, and I would recommend you listen to it.
All right. My next one is called Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. This is a Minnesota Public Radio podcast that airs every Saturday. I listened to episode 1325. This is a weekly news quiz hosted by comedians. It covers the major headlines from the week's news with hilarious stories and anecdotes. They include fake stories with real news stories and invite guests on to guess the real story from the week's news. I love this podcast. I listen to it every week when I'm cleaning the house or something like that. I get a lot of laughs out of it. It's a general, easy listening podcast. The audience could be anybody. However, you may or may not understand it depending on whether or not you follow the week's news. If you don't follow the news, probably most of it will kind of go over your head. So, but it's funny, and they have people, just general public, come on there. They have guest speakers, and they always have a panel of comedians. The pacing is great. I give it a 5 out of 5. It's easy to understand, and overall, one of my favorite podcasts to listen to.
Sometimes there's podcasts you really don't like and understand. For me, that one was The Dollop. It's a history channel. They were covering Marie Dorian. She was a Native woman who was born into the Iowa tribe in Missouri, the St. Louis area. When Marie was a teen, she married this man named Pierre Dorian Jr. The men in this podcast, they really got carried away with making jokes, and some of them I felt were kind of weird, and it just made me feel uncomfortable. I really wanted to know more about this story and this woman because I hear that she has a strong story, but I just really couldn't pay attention to it because it was just going in so many different directions, and I couldn't tell what was the story and what was their jokes. I rate it a 2.5 out of 5.
Okay, my last podcast that I reviewed is another Minnesota Public Radio program. This one is called Up First, And I reviewed it for October 24th, 2022. Boris Johnson not running. Second Weinstein trial begins. Haiti teeters on collapse. So this podcast was about Boris Johnson won't be running as the Prime Minister of the UK. Harvey Weinstein faces a second sexual assault trial. Despite chaos in Port-au-Prince, Haitians don't want another intervention. So this is a daily podcast that gives you all the day's news in a 12 to 13 minute segment. I appreciate this because I refuse to watch hours of depressing news. This way, I only have to be depressed for 12 minutes every morning while I get ready for work. I listen to it every day. I recommend it, especially if you don't want to get sucked into long news programs.
My last one is in the category of life. It is TED Talks Daily. It is titled, "You Actually Don't Know What Your Future Self Wants." And it caught my eye because if you think about yourself 3 years ago, before the pandemic, you see how much you've changed from the anxiety and self-isolation. You think about how does that change one's life? In the podcast, they talk about this woman who wants quality over quantity in her life. She tells her husband that if she were ever in the hospital and she was not able to make the decision to take or keep her off the ventilator, he should have them take her off of it. When that day finally came, she was in the hospital, a little older than what she was. They asked her if she wanted to stay on the ventilator, and before her husband could speak, she interrupted them to say yes. The husband was surprised. He asked her why, and she said that she was a different person than she was the day she made that decision. And that shows that you're constantly changing. You're becoming a new version of yourself. When we, the strangers, we make promises our future self may not be able to carry because we might not have the same wishes as our past self did. We made laws long ago that might have been perfect for the time being, and today they might be seen as absurd. In the podcast, he tells us that there are 3 rules that he uses, and they are: stay curious, try new things and let loose. Number 2, when expressing your views, make sure to add some humility, because you don't want to force your beliefs on others and judge them, because one day you might not believe what you once did before. And 3, be brave. Our future selves will have different skills than we do today. You may say, I don't have the capacity to do those things. That doesn't mean you won't have the capacity to do those things tomorrow. I give this podcast a 5 out of 5 because I really liked how easy it was to listen to. I didn't really get bored, and I found the example story he used was really good. The understanding of it was really personal to me because I make decisions and I sometimes kind of push my opinion out there a lot, and it made me realize that I need to humble myself and know that there's other people who are going to have different beliefs than you do. So I really like that one. It was an eye-opener.
I just want to remind everyone that this podcast has been an opinion podcast. These opinions from Nataya and myself are our opinions. We do suggest that everybody go out and experience these podcasts on their own and develop your own opinions about what you think about them. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you so much, Nataya. This has been a really fun time talking about podcasts. And if anybody ever has any questions about them or wants to learn more, we're here to help. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. Achimigwich to the following for their efforts in the creation of this Red Lake Nation College Gikendaasowin podcast episode. Opening and closing music by Director of Equity, Cultural Education, and Archives, Floyd Buck Jordan. Opening, introduction, and closing by Red Lake Nation College podcast intern Nataya Neadeau. Host this episode, Mandy Schram and Nataya Neadeau. Production by IT Director Josh Nelson and RLNC student Rebecca Peterson. And a special thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for their generous support.